Please welcome back to the stage Matt Honan and our panelists, Janti Soeripto, President and Chief Executive Officer, Save the Children, and Latanya Mapp Frett, President and CEO, Global Fund for Women.
Welcome both.
Thank you.
Earlier today, we were talking with Cynthia and with Palak about the role of the care economy domestically here in the United States. We're going to turn now to looking at a more global perspective. Both of your organizations, focus on women, and they focus on women tend to be internationally. There's some recent research from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that found that women in most countries, where there's data even, not necessarily most countries, but countries where there is data, spend 30 hours or more a week working exclusively on childcare. And that's a full-time job. But that work is often unpaid, it's often unstructured, unsupported. So to begin with, I thought we could talk a little bit about, a question for you about pre-pandemic traditional work and home dynamics and gender roles placed these really unequal responsibilities on women. That was seemingly very much exacerbated over the past 2 years in almost every country around the world. And so now, as it seems like moving to a new phase of this pandemic, I was hoping that maybe you could, we have an opportunity to really rethink how things operated before COVID. And I was hoping I could get your points of view on gender justice and childhood development that might benefit from a reshifting of some of these roles. Latanya, I think maybe we could start with you. Are there some examples that you can share with us of how women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID globally, and how they are leading the response and recovery?
No, thank you so much, Matt, and I'm glad you talked about pre-pandemic, because much of what we saw during COVID was just a beacon light on inequities that we had been seeing years and maybe decades before COVID even happened. And so we know the sort of intersections of inequalities that women experience every day were part of what was the impetus to sort of stand up and highlight those issues during the pandemic. We talk about, sort of women working 30 hours with their children, but we know that is also the same woman who is working at both formal and informal economy jobs. And so the World Bank just released that study that said that, 29% of women left the workforce as opposed to 20% of men who had children. And we do know that 70% of the informal economy around the world is made up of women, probably more than that, but that's some of the stats that we see. And so what it really, really means is that when we saw this increase during the pandemic of domestic violence, because women and girls were home more, when we saw restrictions on reproductive health, and access to things like contraception, which were taking off the essential list in many of the countries. And I know that, Janti, you will talk about this more, but also girls coming out of school. These had, lasting impacts during the pandemic that we're still trying to figure out how we're going to address some of them and what it actually means as we go forward. And I know we have some of these issues in the country, but response, again, those most impacted are going to be the ones that respond the fastest. And so Global Fund for Women saw a great deal of response from feminist movements. We fund, what we do is sort of trust-based, long-term, non-restricted funding. And so we were able to put a call out to the more than 5,000 women's groups that were being supported and say, listen, pivot and use that money any way you can. We saw organizations in Tanzania, for instance, the Maasai Development Organization, who was doing advocacy around healthcare and education, had to switch to water and sanitation, because it's easy for us to just say we need to wash our hands and We need to be apart. But how that translates not into just languages, but to cultures was very difficult in those first months and days for sure. And so the women's groups that we work with had to take on that responsibility of actually shifting to really be concerned about that work. We saw it in Nepal in a relationship with UNFPA. We work with Warwick in the mountainous regions and really had to count on women in communities. We talk about caregivers. They really had to take on the role that the governments were not in explaining what was happening and trying to, even the concept of stay at home when people have to work every day to put dinner on the table was a very difficult thing. And women's groups had to take on that role. And we saw them respond quickly, effectively, and very much, I think, was the backbone of how we were able to address many of the issues we saw.
Something I learned about you just before we came out was that you had formerly been involved with Planned Parenthood, and I'm struck by your optimism and determination and appreciate it. I really am. Thank you. Janti, if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you think the pandemic is going to do in terms of transforming the workforce, especially over the next 3 to 5 years as we begin to recover, we begin to respond to some of the traumas that we've seen around the world. What are your expectations there? What have you been seeing, and what does that lead you to believe how things might change?
Well, I think to pick up on your previous questions as well, we've seen exacerbated but very deeply existing inequalities. Now, my hope would be that we can't unsee it, as one of the previous speakers said, right? So that's been good. All of a sudden, people have thought, oh, we lost 350,000 childcare workers in this country. Now what's going to happen with all those women and men who want to return to the workforce and can't, right? And that level hasn't really been restored after, and that is in the USA, let alone worldwide. I think Save the Children did a global survey to ask children and their families the impact of the pandemic across 40 countries, one of the largest studies, particularly of young children between 11 and 17. And there you could also see the gendered impact of the pandemic. 2/3 of girls were saying, we have to work harder at home to help with chores, schools were closed. Only 40% of boys said that. Lots of domestic violence because of the pandemic. And again, schools were closed. Frontline workers are not always healthcare workers, they're also the teachers as well as the parents who actually have their first and most important teacher, as our first speaker said, but also the one who keeps an eye out for children and make sure that they are safe and protected. So all of these things, I think over the last 2 years has been exacerbated. And I think what we're seeing now, even when schools are opening up, and we almost think here that we're sort of beyond it, in many countries schools are still barely open or back up. What we also see is that there's still 680 million kids out of school or with less access to school. What we also know from the Ebola response in 2014, when schools are closed for such a long time, the poorest children, and in particularly girls or other marginalized groups, are less likely to come back. So they drop out of the system completely. And even when they come back, they have a bigger gap because the learning loss that they have suffered over the intervening period has not been compensated as much as for children that come from more resilient households.
How do we address that? How do we begin to address that even?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. And I do think one of the things that gave me hope over the last 2.5 years, that we saw an enormous amount of local innovation coming from the communities themselves and our teams and many of our peer organizations, funders like Latanya's, who've been incredibly flexible and more strategic and attuned to what people needed on the ground. So, in Uganda, one of our teams really started to grapple with the issue of learning loss for kids. We are piloting catch-up clubs. And it sounds so simple, right? Actually, we use them, a similar intervention here in the United States to overcome summer learning loss, which is an issue for many kids, nothing to do with the pandemic. So how do you help kids come back to school and overcome, let's say that they haven't learned a lot over the last 2 years? So we do an intervention. It's actually pretty low tech. There's a little bit of tech, but a lot of it is low tech, including play, meeting kids where they are. And not in terms of their age, we approach them, but we say, okay, so where are you in terms of your literacy, your numeracy, And how do we then help you catch up in a series of really intensive interventions over a prolonged period? And we give their families cash so that they have an incentive to not have their kids working, for instance, or marry their girls off in child marriage, which we've also seen happen more often because of the issues that we just discussed. So I think there are relatively low-cost, tried and tested interventions that we are seeing. We now need to find a way to scale them up and make sure that they really withstand the test of time as well.
Tanya, when we talk about the care economy, a lot of the times we're talking about healthcare workers, educators, but when you talk about it, it's my understanding you also have included, you think of activists and people who are doing advocacy work as part of this economy, as a vital part of the care economy. Can you explain what you mean by that, and what role does that have in creating an economy of care?
Well, I think it's, we have this, understanding of care workers and what they do in the home, what they do, of course, for us outside the home, in hospitals and so forth. But much of the change, and I'm talking about systemic and structural change over the last century, has come from more people power, from activism, from really changing the systems and the way they exist in the world. And that has come from movement makers, movement actors. And most of those movement actors are those that are the most impacted. So at Global Fund for Women, we know gender justice and the activism associated with it is really connected to the care economy in the most profound way. Because it is the thing that's going to change the structure so we better respect. I think if you go all the way back to your first conversation today, if you better respect and put value on the things that women in particular do through the care work, then we will have a system and a structure that addresses that needs and be able to actually care for them. And I think that is the core. We know about this work. I know I see Sakina Yakuba from Afghanistan in the audience, and she'll talk tomorrow, but we know that you can't just work on one issue. Women can't. Caregivers can't. We have to work at the intersection of climate, racial injustice. We have to look at all of these issues across the spectrum, and that is what activism and advocacy does, because it's going to not just change for the moment and provide some support and praise, which is lovely, but it's going to change the kind of system that will allow us to look at as caregivers at the bottom of the spectrum. And that's why movements are so important, that collective action. And it is why Global Fund for Women supports that at its essence, and not just in sectoral terms, but across the board for what communities and women need.
To bring that down a little bit from a theoretical to an actual example, are there examples that you can talk about where you've seen people who have used the power of advocacy and activism to help make these types of changes?
Absolutely, and we just went through a phase of generation equality. So some of you may know at the UN and through UN Women, we were able to work together, and I suspect that Save the Children was a part of a group of movement makers but not just civil society, not just activists, but corporations and governments and multilaterals and bilaterals coming together to try to work on the issue of gender equality. We've fallen behind way before COVID, and the opportunity is now to highlight that and to move on. And so in the area, and I'll just say because we're at Solve, of technology and innovation, we saw a great deal of support coming together to talk about solutions that are already out there. Solve is great because we're coming together to talk about new solutions, but there are solutions being made every day in communities around the world,
right,
and in particularly in the Global South, because they have to in order to address their needs. And we have to be able to find them. We often put the onus on them to find funders, to find us at these big schools, and that's just impossible for them to do. Why can't we use technology to be able to find them in the moment that they need us the most? When they're coming up with innovations in their communities, that all they need is a little bit to be able to spark change and to do it differently. Why can't we find them? I figure if I could, put in my Google that I want to find a pair of black sandals, and every time I go to my email, there's a whole bunch of black sandals over here, then I figured in the conversations around gender justice and collective action, I can also find them around the world. And we're actually trying to do that at Global Fund for Women. So, thank you.
Janti, you alluded to this earlier, but maybe you could elaborate for us a little bit on the ways that you see cycles of poverty affecting girls, usually, at a very young age, and how that plays out over the course of their lives, and maybe even what types of interventions, you alluded to that earlier, we can do there.
Well, I think maybe bring it back to the earliest speaker, actually, who talked about the importance of early childhood education. Right? We know that even in this country, there are communities where 50, 60% of kids do not have access to early childhood education. We also know that those kids, when they enter school, they are already behind and therefore less likely to be successful throughout their school career, and that has a knock-on effect on lifelong earning, their ability to have great jobs, create a business, etc. We see that the world over. I would say, and that does in the end also end up in intergenerational poverty and all of the harmful cycles. We also know that and businesses should, take notice, because they're looking, and now we're seeing it firsthand, all of us, not just here but everywhere. There's a shortage of skilled workers, of skilled staff everywhere. How is that possible if we have technology platforms who can find us black sandals when we need them? Right. Ostensibly more data than we sometimes know what to do with. Right? But we're not using it to actually help give kids who need it access to really early education and then help them be successful in school. And I think it does come back to value. When I became a mother for the first time and I dropped my 6-month-old daughter at the childcare center, and part of me was thinking, so the most important thing to me in this world, I'm handing over to someone, and I actually don't think we're paying her enough. Right? How can that be that we don't value that? What makes us all not only be able to work, to develop ourselves, etc., but to also care for the things that we hold most dear.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed being in person and getting to have all these incredible ideas, and it's a fortunate experience that we have to do that. But it makes me think that we have more to do, and I would love to hear from each of you what you think might be notes of optimism and opportunity. Latanya, maybe you could start there.
Yeah, and I love this part because this is the part that we get to talk about fiction, and I think the head from Moderna, he started yesterday at the opening talking about science fiction, those things that we don't think are possible. And I really do believe that for the work that we do in gender equality, we have to stop thinking about what sort of separates us and what's the obstacles in our way, and think about what's possible, what's the world we want, so we can start moving towards that. And really, if you think about funding, and this is my dream, is that right now, funding women's organizations, they get 1% of overseas development assistance. That's 1%. That means 99% of the care that we care so much about is not being funded in the Global South. And I think we have to envision a world, what would it look like if even just half, even if just 50%, even 49.9% of that funding went to women and their ideas, their innovation, their enterprises, their movements, and what would that look like? And so for me, that is the opportunity. We're at a point now where we understand that women, Black and brown people, disabled people, and climate justice is another one. If we just put a little bit more towards those efforts, what would the world look like? And I want to dream, and I want the fiction to be real. So I applaud the work that people are doing to think about how we get there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Janti, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think, and you have to be an optimist in this line of work, right? Because otherwise you don't last, for sure. I think we've seen a lot of phenomenal, locally led innovation happen on the ground, and I totally agree with you. There's not enough visibility of that, and we need to find a way to make that more visible for the world outside of the halls of MIT. Much as I love them, but and it's particularly when we talk about gender norms. We've done a couple of programs over the last number of years where we work with fathers, with husbands. We've created a husband school in Ethiopia to make sure that they understand that when their women work and develop themselves and can be entrepreneurs or have great jobs, they also have a role to play because it will change the dynamics in the family as well. Right. And when we take the fathers and the husbands along in that journey, we see phenomenal outcomes, not just in terms of women being able to hold jobs, but also in terms of how those power dynamics shift over time. And again, not all of this is high tech, not every solution is necessarily an app, they can be helpful, but I think if we make the design of those interventions really human-centered, as one of the previous speakers said, I think that will go a long way. And those results are there if we choose to look.
Well, thank you both so much.